Drawing faces is hard. Drawing faces from imagination is harder. And drawing faces from imagination in any angle is impossible. Except it isn't. Tons of artists have done it before, which is why over a month ago, I decided to figure it out by making a challenge for myself within the 30 days I was traveling in China. And the challenge is simple. We're going to draw a minimum of 100 faces, learn to draw them completely from imagination, and finally, master the ability to accurately depict the unique features of individual faces. And by the end of it all, we'll test our understanding by drawing a specific character head in 25 angles with only one reference to help us better capture their unique features and proportions. Over the initial 17 days, which I covered in the first video, we drew a total of 78 faces. But the problem is, we dedicated too much of our time to studying a few of these angles, which left us with less than half of the remaining time to study the rest, including learning to capture unique faces and expressions. And in this video, I'll share with you in detail what I learned from studying each individual angle, guide you through my thought process as I attempt to learn these skills, and show you the exact methods I used to study to improve. Because at the end of the day, whether you want to become an animator, concept artist, or illustrator like me, mastering the human face is a highly valuable skill. So without further ado, let's continue from where we left off. And so we came home to Wuhan after traveling across the western region of China, finally getting a chance to settle down and focus on the challenge ahead. But over the 78 faces drawn from the 10-day road trip, I realized I was still missing something really important. Like in any study, we're looking to copy the reference. But in order to really understand the face, you need to do more than just get a one-to-one copy. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with just focusing on copying, of course. In fact, copying accurately is an essential skill for artists. Understanding, however, is equally as important. I realized after all those studies that I needed to memorize the 2D shapes while understanding the 3D form. I was already doing this subconsciously to some degree, so taking this concept and consciously applying it into our studying process would look something like this. First, let's use a reference to analyze. In this case, we'll use a photo studying this angle. We want to memorize the 2D shapes we see, for example, the shapes of the eyes, nose, or temple, and understand the 3D forms. A good way to test your understanding of form is to trace wires across the forms of the face. Now when you're ready, let's take that reference away and start drawing the guidelines of the Loomis head. Now you can find a full tutorial on the Loomis head method on Proko's channel. I think he did the best job of explaining it. And guidelines are important. It's kind of like constructing a building. You'll need to start with scaffolding and a plan. You don't start with random parts and hope it'll work out in the end. As usual, we want to start with a sphere representing the cranium and a cross representing the brow line and the center line. This will tell us the direction the head is facing in perspective. As an artist, you're a visual translator, so use your eyes as the input. Interpret what you see by visualizing the 3D structure of the face in your head. This step might take practice for some, while others may understand it more intuitively. But don't worry, it's a skill that everyone can develop. But to pack it all together, using everything we've just observed from the reference, let's finally output that visualization onto the guidelines and fit everything into place. Let's use our understanding of the 3D form to flesh out the drawing and fall back to the 2D shapes we memorized from earlier as additional aid. In realism, the 3D forms justify the 2D shapes. The combination of these two elements will complement each other in aiding you to draw faces from any angle. So, continuing with the next angle to study, let's try to implement this by consciously applying those concepts while drawing. By this point, we've already studied a less extreme version of this angle, so a lot of potential challenges were already addressed for the most part. For example, something I struggled with was drawing the forehead too big due to not fully understanding how the top plane of the head goes back into space, or how we deal with drawing the bottom plane of the jaw. But I noticed something unique about this angle. Depending on how extreme the perspective is, there's a point at which the eyes and nose barely have any distance apart, and sometimes they're even completely blocked. Luckily, with no longer having time constraints of being on the road, I got to studying immediately, and we were able to finish 12 studies in this angle. I was beginning to feel a lot more used to drawing each feature in this angle, including understanding the structure of the nose better and getting the shapes of the eyes more accurately than before. We ended our day with eating dinner at one of the biggest malls in Wuhan. It's not often that I get to experience amazing foods and shop around, so it's a nice change of pace for once. But I knew I had limited time to enjoy here because in the coming few days, there's going to be even less opportunity to draw since we'll be visiting 3 separate cities that were in completely different directions: Shenzhen, Beijing, and Shanghai. So let's try to squeeze in as many studies as we can tomorrow while we still have time. Today is going to be a busy day. Besides trying to get all our studies in, there's actually quite a few errands I needed to run because it's my uncle's birthday. So we spent the first half of our day gathering ingredients, ordering cake, and cooking. And once we finally had time to sit down and draw, I began straight away. For 2 of the drawings, I tried to push the foreshortening even further to the point where the eyes and nose looked like they were on the same horizontal axis. But the hardest part was getting the structure of the chin and bottom of the jaw correct. I realized from analyzing my drawings from the previous day that simplifying the 3 planes on the bottom of the jaw into a curved, flatter plane looked much more appealing than 3 separate planes. Because while it's true that it can be separated into 3 separate planes, I tended to over-exaggerate the structure, causing them to make the bottom of the jaw look a little bloated. During our study session, we were hit with some sort of ominous sounding alarm. Huh. But back to studying, we finished 8 more faces, completing 20 faces in this angle in total. And while I'm far from mastering this angle, we still have a lot more angles and specific faces to study if we want to beat this challenge. So let's lock in. We're fast approaching 100 faces, which is one of the 3 goals to hit in this challenge. And we're making good progress on learning how to draw each angle from imagination. But remember, we still need to learn to capture unique faces for the final test. And starting today, we're about to do a whole lot of traveling again, which means less time to study. The next destination is Shenzhen. The plan was to take the train there in the evening, which means even less time to study. So we really needed to take advantage of whatever time we had. We ended up taking the subway to the train stop. Their subway system had really strict safety policies. Everyone who went in had to put their bags through a scanner, similar to an airport, and if you had any bottled liquids, you had to take a sip to demonstrate that it was inflammable. But once we arrived at the train station, our cheap train ticket got us aboard a regular train, with pretty tight seating, little privacy, and a longer ride since this wasn't a bullet train. Either way, this isn't going to stop us from studying. The next angle on the docket is 3/4 looking down. The challenge for this angle is getting the proportion of the cranium right, along with drawing the features correctly despite the foreshortening. With very little experience drawing this angle, I'll have to rely on my understanding of forms and put even more attention into getting the proportions right. I quickly came to realize that this angle was the most challenging to study so far. I had no access to references, and as you'll see, there's a lot wrong with most of these faces. Yet it was exciting to attempt. Each time was another opportunity to get it right, another shot at understanding the piece I was missing. With hindsight, the most common mistake here comes from the proportion of the cranium in relation to the front plane of the face, because in nearly all of the other angles, we're mostly dealing with just the landmarks of the frontal or side plane. This angle in particular added another plane that I was very unfamiliar with, so that's something we can put more of our focus on. Another thing that I realized about these studies is that I kept overestimating the foreshortening, causing the faces to look extra flattened. So that's also something we'll have to pay attention to tomorrow when we do these studies. Despite the fact that the amount of faces we've drawn so far has passed our initial goal of 100 faces, I was beginning to feel a little unsure if my current understanding of faces was enough or will be enough. Because the numbers isn't actually an accurate representation of how much I've learned, since mileage doesn't directly correlate with progress. And with the lack of time to study each angle more in depth, my confidence on beating this final test was waning. My fear of not meeting my own expectations was growing. What if after drawing all these faces, I wasn't actually learning as much as I thought? What if during the final test, I realized that I still struggle with a lot of the problems I was hoping to fix. And does that prove that this entire challenge and my study methods were ineffective? And it was in this moment that I realized something really important. The number of faces I drew wasn't actually the thing that was going to help me learn the fastest. Rather, I noticed the most improvement when I was consistently identifying problems, then trying to find solutions to those problems. Sounds obvious, but it seems drawing out of habit and without thinking is the path of least resistance. So from this point forward, let's try to put more focus onto active problem solving. With a whole day ahead of us, I was tired as fuck. I hate trains, and fuck you, Thomas. We were mainly here to visit more family friends, and we weren't staying the night, so there wasn't much time to actually explore the city. But I did get to enjoy some nice Shenzhen delicacies, including pigeon meat. It pretty much tasted like duck, except it came in a smaller portion. And after an entire day of meeting up, all I wanted was some time alone. And luckily, this time around, we were riding a bullet train on our way back, with slightly more comfortable seats and more privacy. Continuing with yesterday's study, let's try to solve for that proportional problem we were struggling with. So using a method I learned from a good friend of mine, to counteract this, let's overcompensate for our problem by leaning the other way. So since we kept squishing the face, let's draw extra long faces and adjust it from there. With the lack of rest from yesterday, I tried my best not to be too sloppy with the studies, and we ended up drawing 7 faces in total, and while we still did make the same mistakes at times, I started to get the proportions better for a few of them. But considering the lack of time we had, and also the things we had yet to study, we're gonna have to move on to the next angle. We arrived home by midnight and thankfully got a chance to rest up. By this point, we have a little over a week to study the rest of the angles, practice expressions, and learn how to capture unique faces. Today we'll be heading to Beijing in the evening to meet up with more relatives for a day before staying in Wuhan for 3 additional days. And then finally we'll drive to Shanghai to enjoy the rest of our time there. We've come a long way, but we'll need to work even harder to beat the challenge in the remaining time. In the afternoon, we're getting the acupuncture special for the first time, because apparently the traditional Chinese doctors have a method of healing eczema, so I thought I'd give it a try. The initial pokes weren't even too bad, but they would cover you up to apply even more pressure onto the needles, so breathing too hard would cause the needles to dig in deeper into your chest or back. I found this situation kind of comical for some reason, but I tried to hold in my laughter to avoid the needles getting in deeper, which only made it funnier because of how ridiculous the situation was. But eventually, after our 1-hour session, we got back home to prepare for tonight's trip. We're gonna take another non-bullet train to Beijing at around 6 p.m. So we pack our luggage and head towards the train stop. This time I was hoping I would get slightly more rest than the last time because this train is specifically designed for overnight trips. Each compartment is separated into multiple rooms with 6 beds each, basically a pair of triple bunk beds for each room. We got one of the middle bunks, which isn't bad because we have a good view and it's a lot more accessible than the beds at the top. So for today we're moving to this angle. We won't need to deal with side planes and we've already studied a fair share of arguably a lot more difficult angles. So these ones were pretty straightforward. Surprisingly, I actually felt like the default head was the most foreign to me because I was mainly going off of memorized 2D shapes rather than having to think about form like when we were studying the rest of the angles. Something notable about these angles is the unintuitive placement of the ear. Now here's a question. This head is looking up. Where do you think the placement of the ear makes the most sense here? A, B, or C? I'll give you some time to think. If you chose C, here's your I know where to place the ear on the head award. And if you chose A, congratulations as well. You just drew Shrek's long lost cousin. Now what if the head was looking down? Yep, it would be the inverse of looking up, so A would be the correct answer. Okay, now here's a hard one. What if the angle is way more extreme? The answer is also A. Now, why is this the case, and how can we determine where the ear lies regardless of the angle? To better understand this, let's go to the side view. Think of the eye to ear relationship as kind of a teeter-totter. If one goes up, the other goes down. And it's as simple as that. We finished 7 faces during the ride. And when I finally attempted to fall asleep this time, I passed out. As soon as we arrived, we got picked up and got a tour of the prestigious Peking University, or should I say, Beijing Daxue. Our tour guide was actually born in this area since both of our parents were actually professors who taught here. The campus was huge and there was a surprising amount of foreigners. According to her, most of the students here could speak English at a conversational level, which was dope. Not that I planned on striking up a conversation with anyone, but I felt a little more at home, and the professors even had their own little neighborhood. Each house would be for a professor and their family, and if they chose to leave, then they would also lose access to the house. After a quick stroll, we grabbed a bite to eat and explored a garden that once belonged to the emperor. At the top of the garden, there was a temple featuring a statue of the 1,000-armed Nguyen. We even bumped into some like-minded individuals. And I'm sure there was a bunch more that we could explore if we had more time on our hands, but eventually we had to head back to catch our train. Like last time, we're taking a bullet train back, which takes significantly less time to travel since we're going at around 300 kilometers per hour. And since we've already covered the hard angles up front, these angles didn't pose much of a challenge. It's like the feeling you get finishing side quests after you've already cleared the final boss. So let's use this opportunity to review some principles we learned from our previous studies, including remembering how to place the eye in a 3/4 angle. By completing these studies, we've officially covered all of the angles, which now means we can draw faces from practically any angle. But there's no point in drawing expressionless faces, because at the end of the day, we want to say something through our art, to tell stories or to evoke emotions. So without a good understanding of drawing expressions, there really isn't a point in just knowing how to draw default faces. And since 7 days isn't much time to study at all, we're gonna have to find a way to cover the essentials. We eventually arrived home not long after dark, grabbed some dinner at a local mom and pop store before we called it a day. Now that we're back, this will be our final stay in Wuhan. So in the remaining 3 days, let's try to enjoy the city with what time we have left, because not only does the scenery feel like it came straight out of a movie, but they also have very lively streets at night and many stores open past after hours. With so many places to see, this also means we'll have to balance our time between studying and exploring. Since there are way too many emotions and expressions to study in too little time, we're gonna have to simplify what we know about expressions to make it a little more digestible. So first off, expressions at their core are a combination of different facial movements. For example, surprise and fear both have wide eyes and raised eyebrows, but one has a slight wrinkle in the nose area and a tightened jaw, whereas the other can have more of a relaxed or dropped jaw. Anger also has a tightened jaw, but the eyes and eyebrows would be glaring and furrowed. The point is, instead of learning words by memorizing a sheer amount of vocabulary, if we study the underlying components of each expression, like the prefixes or suffixes of words, we can craft expressions however we want. Since people are trained to read expressions through social interactions, most people can already intuitively understand these combinations, so there's really no point in studying those specifically. And plus, we can always use ourselves as a reference, but we'll leave that to once we actually start studying. In the meantime, let's explore the city. So we tried the driverless taxi services to travel since it's a whole lot cheaper than taxis. So cheap, in fact, a whole ride costs around 15 RMB, which translates to around 2 USD. Luckily for the taxi drivers, the major downside to these cars is that they can only operate in certain areas due to safety restrictions, since traffic in these cities can get a little crazy and overcomplicated. During the night, we explored the more popular shopping districts. The street is entirely closed off for cars and any other vehicles of that matter, which is why they have these guardrails up. So people and their pets, food stands, and other unique vendors have more space to operate. There was so much variety. We even found a mall dedicated to anime merch, cosplay, and art. Coincidentally, while we were checking it out, there was an anime convention going on, so you'd see tons of cosplayers on the streets and in the mall. However, with our time constraints and the test day approaching, we should probably start soon. So, during my free time, I developed a strategy to condense the content so we could focus more on the important aspects of expression before our remaining time ran out. And now to study expressions. So let's start by simplifying and separating the face into 3 major regions: upper, middle, and lower. Now let's briefly go over the major movements in each region. Firstly, the upper region includes the eyes and eyebrows. The eyes can vary in shape and a little in position, while the eyebrows, when compressed, will clinch down towards the nose, or if it's raised, it will push up against the forehead. In each case, this can cause wrinkles and affect the forms of the other regions. In the middle region, we have the cheeks and nose area. The cheeks lift up when active and stays in a neutral position, only showing a contour when the mouth pushes up against it or when it pushes up against the eyelids. Now for the nose area, the wings of the nose can lift, raising the upper lip while also causing a wrinkle on both or either sides of the nose. This wrinkle can be stretched further if the mouth is fully open. The upper nose near the brow can also clinch up towards the point of tension, causing the nose and brow to squeeze towards the eyes, most commonly seen in angry expressions. And now finally for the lower region. This includes the mouth and jaw hinge. The mouth is capable of a wide range of motions, especially when we use it for talking. So for simplicity's sake, let's focus on the changes in the 2D shape and the corners of the mouth. And finally for the jaw hinge, many people aren't quite sure how to draw the teeth in perspective when the jaw is open, and for this we can think about where the jaw joint connects and make sure that they look like they're leading towards those points. Now that we know some of the basic facial movements, we can start applying these concepts into our studies. The hard part here is visualizing and translating your understanding of 3D form, like I mentioned in the beginning of this video. And so, because we've already studied all the angles, we have leverage in knowing the base forms, which makes this task so much easier. And now, our job would be to tweak the face according to the movement of the expression in the correct perspective. It's kind of like solving an equation. We're using the known variables to solve for x. For example, let's say we're drawing an angry expression in the 3/4 looking down angle. We already know how to draw the default face in this angle, so let's use that as our base. Our other known variables are, we know that angry expressions raise the cheeks and pinch the face towards the nose area tension point, and with this information, we can infer that the distance between the cheeks and the eyes are much closer. And so in our drawing, we can indicate this both in silhouette and form shading. Solving each movement is like a fun little puzzle, and that's what I love about studying this way. Instead of making it a painful exercise, we can think of it as a series of mini challenges to test our problem-solving abilities, and outside of that, the more we test ourselves with these puzzles, the more solutions we accumulate that eventually become instinct. And so drawing different faces in different angles eventually becomes a matter of pattern recognition. And with that, we completed 26 studies and learned how to draw expressions in different angles. And now we begin our last stretch towards the finish line. Early into the morning, we had to pack up and prepare to leave the city for good. We've come such a long way from where we began. From once struggling to draw a basic head in slightly different angles, to now being able to confidently draw faces in different angles with different expressions, our progress is undeniable. But our work here isn't done. Our final journey to Shanghai will begin with a small detour to Suzhou to visit my cousin's university, whose campus is no less appealing than Peking University. In fact, the campus itself is almost the size of a small city, and I'm not exaggerating. Apparently, they have a total population of 30,000 people, including staff, teachers, and students. Their campus is probably 5 times the size of where I went to college. They also have a man-made lake with a dozen black swans surrounding their beautiful library. And my favorite part about their entire campus had to be their cafeteria. It was full of options of many styles of food, And all around you could see students hanging out and studying together, something I wish I could have experienced more while I was still in school. But we got a private suite for lunch, and we were mistaken as a pair of students with their professors because it's common here for teachers who have a small class of students to take them out and grab lunch. Eventually, we part ways and arrive at our hotel. Since there's only a few days left, we're going to have to study to capture unique faces fast, or we'll fail the challenge. To tackle this part of the challenge, let's use a similar approach from what we did with expressions, but this time let's choose a character and try to apply the form changes from the reference of the character onto the guidelines we create. And so with the time I had, I did a few studies before bed. Today we depart from Suzhou and arrive in Shanghai around the evening. I've grown a sort of fondness for these kinds of road trips. I was especially missing the initial excitement from the 10-day road trip where we got to meet all sorts of people at pit stops and enjoy the stunning scenery. So seeing as this is going to be our last long drive across China, let's try to enjoy it while it lasts. After a long drive, we finally arrive in Shanghai and find our way to the hotels. For the majority of this trip, we've been consistently going to one branch of hotels. I really dig their aesthetic. Their interior design has a very modern yet simple twist to Eastern culture. And in total, it only costs around $60 per night Canadian, which is an amazing price for the quality we were getting. And apparently this is considered only a mid-level hotel. On top of all that, the breakfast options were quite nice. I really enjoyed their salted duck eggs paired with congee. Now to study for the final part of this challenge. For the most part, let's treat it similarly to how we studied expressions, except our known variables this time would be based on the references we use. I chose to study characters from the show Arcane, because in the Arcane style, they have very exaggerated proportions to distinguish characters from each other. And the more distinguished the characters are, the easier it is to see the proportional differences. So I chose to study one of my favorite characters from the show and my main, Victor.
Victor Nation, how are we feeling?
To keep things simple, let's only try to draw his face without expressions in different angles, especially since I found it quite challenging from yesterday's studies. And when things are too challenging, I find that simplifying the problem helps, because sometimes by taking it bit by bit can actually help us learn faster rather than staying stuck on a big problem over a long period of time. I did, however, change one thing about my approach to these studies, and that is to draw the heads in pairs. We can start by drawing a default head in that angle, and then use it as reference when we're drawing the head of Victor in the exact same angle. We finished 5 pairs of heads before the end of the day, with pretty satisfactory results. A huge improvement from the day before, and the trick is to identify the proportions of the major landmarks. The way I like to measure it is measuring the distance between the major landmarks on the face. So for example, the distance between the eyes and the nose. In Victor specifically, he has a longer than average distance between his eyes and nose and an extremely short forehead to hairline ratio. With these observations, we can now modify our initial Loomis head guidelines to fit this character. We can also see that he has a very protruded brow ridge, sharp cheekbones, and also a beauty mark near his nose. And once we make the adjustments according to these observations and finally add the hair, it all comes together surprisingly smoothly. Seeing as we only have 2 days left, we'll need more mileage in order to really internalize what we've learned. The problem is, we still have quite a few relatives to meet and places to see. So with our limited time, let's make sure we spend it wisely. After visiting a few relatives, we get situated and start preparing. Same thing as yesterday, except let's choose a different character. This time, we'll go with Savika. The first thing we want to look for in our reference are any features that stand out. At first glance, what do you see? The things that stick out to me immediately are her hooked nose. Her nostrils start at a higher point on the face compared to the bulb of her nose, making her seem naturally more angry. This plays well into her character since she's very fierce in the show. Her face follows the 4 major Loomis head guidelines, so no adjustments needed there. Another thing that pops out to me is her dark eyeshadow and lipstick. This contrast, while unrelated to proportions, will make the drawing feel more like her. And with that, I completed 3 more pairs of faces before getting ready to visit my other uncle.
它颜色好像不是灰的，不是灰的。哎呦，啊，是灰呀，比我了。哎，可是哥哥老稳了。是啊。
Once we met up, the first thing we did was visit this modern outdoor shopping district that was repurposed from what used to be a naval base. And I have to say, I was very pleasantly surprised. Every shop or restaurant had their uniquely designed exteriors. Each section brings a very distinct energy, and there was a lot of variety. Some of it was under construction, but they had everything from live music bars to cozy cafes to lots of random shops selling niche items. After we grab dinner, we're gonna head to my other uncle's place since we're staying with him for the night. With full bellies, we headed to his house, where I was promptly reminded the difference between the lifestyles of people who live comfortably versus lower income households, because his neighborhood was full of luxurious mansions and cars. For context, most residential areas in China usually consist of apartment complexes because of the density of people. So living in a neighborhood with uniquely designed Western-style houses was a privilege. We did 2 more pairs of heads for Savika before we called it a day. Early in the morning, I got to hear my uncle play on the grand piano. He's actually preparing for a rehearsal tonight, so he needed to get ready. I also got to give it a go. Like in learning any skill, actively identifying your weaknesses plays a huge part in improving. So it was interesting seeing the overlap in how my uncle went about studying piano. He also had a lot of other interesting things at his place. One of them being cricket fighting. Now back in my uncle's day, because of the lack of brain rot Instagram Reels and TikTok, to fill the time, they would bet money on whose crickets were stronger, put them in a ring like bug boxing, except the loser would die. It's kind of like Bakugan for adults. I also made friends with their dog named Lady. She was 14, so a granny in dog years, but she had a sweet and gentle soul. However, we had to part ways after our brief little get-together and prepare for our flight back tomorrow. Considering this will be our last opportunity to study, let's try to limit test a bit. We'll draw a different character for each face in any angle with any expression, and try to combine all the concepts we learned so far, starting with guidelines, adjusting the landmarks according to the character's unique proportions, and making educated guesses on how the forms change based on the facial movements of different expressions. And with that, we've completed the studying portion of this challenge, finishing at 187 faces total, almost double our initial goal. All that's left now is to do what we trained for. We took a layover flight to Japan before landing in Toronto the next day. After all these studies, I'm feeling quite confident about capturing unique faces. My only concern is how accurately and consistently we'll be able to capture faces from different angles. The good thing is, I didn't set any time restrictions for the challenge, and will also be equipped with the power of digital art, which will make it so much easier with all the tools now at our disposal. So without further ado, let's get started. For the final test, we'll be drawing Silco. For the first step, let's analyze the reference. Similar to how we studied Victor, we can see that there are a few notable features unique to Silco, and we'll draw based on these observations. Let's also not forget about memorizing the 2D shapes while trying to understand and interpret the 3D forms. To keep things simple, we'll draw all the heads without expressions, and we'll go in order from left to right, top to bottom row. The first angles didn't pose much of a challenge since we've studied an ample amount of upwards angles, so I was pretty prepared. A lot of it was using memorized 2D shapes from our practice, for example, the shape of the underjaw, except we'd tweak it according to the rough estimate of Silco's measurements. But the real challenge was still ahead of us. Not only did we have to rush studying quite a few angles because of the time crunch, but I also didn't get the time to fully digest the things we studied. So my confidence for certain angles were very shaky. But so far so good. I felt pretty satisfied with the heads, and I was on a roll. By the time I got to the third row of heads, that's where I began to run into my first major obstacles. The angles I struggled with the most were actually the angles looking straight forward, especially the default head. I felt copying from the reference would defeat the purpose of the challenge, and so that led me to make my own inaccurate estimations. Because of that, I ended up having to restart, which was frustrating because at this point, 2 hours have already passed, and since I was planning to do this in one go, I knew I had to go faster before losing too much stamina. This problem was also a result of skimming over studying this specific angle during our ride to Shenzhen. But we'll have to move on anyways. Once we passed the 3-hour mark, that's where everything began to go downhill. I was starting to feel mentally drained and tried to push through it to avoid dragging it out for too long. I also began to feel more pressure because I didn't want to lose the same quality of faces we had from the start. Due to all these reasons, I was less focused, causing the heads to be less consistent and accurate overall. It was a mental battle between trying to maintain quality by redoing all the mistakes and trying to finish this efficiently. Eventually we got to the last row. This was by far going to be the most challenging. I had very little experience to rely on and many gaps of knowledge that I needed to work out on the spot, so let's do our best. As expected, I struggled a lot trying to figure out the proportional relationships between the top and front planes of the head. But going off of our experience, I was able to scrap by consciously drawing the cranium smaller and then readjusting from there. Admittedly, I was feeling really exhausted at this point, and I tried to draw these last few heads as quickly as possible while trying to meet a minimum threshold of quality. And by the end of a long and grueling 4 hours and 48 minutes, we completed all 25 heads, and I was just glad to be finished without too much trouble. And with that, we've officially completed the 30-day challenge. From traveling to the highest mountains to the busiest cities, we got to see it all while learning how to draw faces from imagination. From barely being able to draw a face in slightly different angles, to now being able to confidently draw specific faces in every angle, we've made a huge leap towards becoming a better artist. But despite feeling a huge sense of relief upon finishing, there are clearly angles that still aren't good enough. Whether they completely missed the mark on looking like Soko, or have a lot of structural errors. It's evident that there's still a lot we need to study before we can truly claim we understand how to draw faces from every angle from imagination. But to be honest, the real purpose of this challenge wasn't actually to draw heads from imagination, but rather to improve my structural understanding of the head. And to that extent, I can confidently say we passed with flying colors. All this to say, even though we didn't fully succeed this challenge, it was very much worth the pursuit. And while these small victories may seem insignificant in the grand scheme of things, it's these small but silent victories we get through studying that will give us the confidence to continue to push ourselves and become great artists. So let's keep challenging ourselves to becoming the best. And as a wise man once said, drawing faces is hard. Drawing them from imagination is harder, but drawing them from imagination in any angle is very much possible. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk. Okay, on a more serious note, thank you for sticking to the end of the video, and if you would like to see more of my content, you can catch me live on Twitch, where we're going to do all sorts of illustrations and give critiques and feedbacks and, I don't know, random stuff. So I'll see you there, or I'll see you in the next one.